hopefully this is coming through for everybody. You see the title there? Give me a thumbs up if you see the title on the screen. Okay, cool. One of the first, I guess, life-changing things that happened for me in the world of change. If you've read any of my stuff, you know that I'm a huge fan of AYE, which was an experiential conference in the US hosted by Jerry Weinberg and Esther Derby and Johanna Rothman, Don Gray and Steve Smith. And I actually got shoulded into going to that. So I was working in this transformation mid-2000s, and one of the coaches there who I was working with said, "Have you ever heard of this AYE thing?" And I'm like, "No." And he's like, "You'd probably like it. You should go. And you should go into the sessions that make you feel like really icky and you would rather be anywhere else than go to that session." And I was like, "All right." So they held it in Arizona, and I went down there, and the very first session was Steve Smith doing a simulation on the Satir change model. So he had all the different groups enact a piece of that model. So that's the infamous J curve, where we're humming along at the status quo. There's a foreign element that kind of disrupts the status quo, and that sends us or the system into chaos. We hit the transforming idea when we kind of figure out what's in it for us, and then we go into practice and integration. We integrate the new learnings and things into our new self, and we arrive at the new status quo. So the way he did the session was there was a star, and the star's job was to make it from one corner of the room to the other corner of the room. And this was a gigantic conference room. We probably, I don't know, maybe we had 70 people in that session. And I was part of the status quo group. He just randomly assigned people. So we thought the best way to keep the star in our corner was to physically build a wall to keep him there. So we started running around the hotel, and we started grabbing tables and chairs and stuff out of the kitchen and everywhere. And we physically built a wall and draped it with tablecloths so we could keep the person in the corner. And I'm sure they were probably not asked to go back to that hotel after that. But then the new status quo, their job was to try to get the star from one corner of the room to the other. And the group that was chaos was just supposed to disrupt the place. So there was a bunch of people who were acting as chaos, and they were just running around screaming and clapping their hands and just like generally being disruptive. The new status quo people came over and they started pulling the wall down. So we tried to stop them from doing it. We started putting things back up, and then it got a little physical. And before Steve started this thing, this is what he said. He's like, I have no idea what's going to happen, but let's just give it a shot. And then 5 minutes in, he had to stop. Steve's like 6'7", skinny as a rail, huge booming voice, and he just yells out, "All right, stop!" And everybody just stopped dead in their tracks because it was getting kind of shovey. You know, the new status quo people were like, "Get out of the way. We're trying to get at that person." And we're like, "No, you get out of the way." And that, well, one, that scared the shit out of me because I'm like, this is highly intelligent change coaches and change agents who almost got in a brawl 5 minutes into a simulation. So I was like, oh man, maybe I'm in the wrong profession. But the other part was that it was kind of life altering because the debrief was magical. To close off the story about what actually happened, when he restarted the simulation, the way the new status quo got the star to cross to the other side of the room is they found out that he was a huge fan of Johanna Rothman, who was delivering a session next door. And so the new status quo, they went over and got her and said, "Can you come over to our session for 5 minutes? We want to just set up a chat with like the star of this session." And she came over, and as soon as he saw her, he was like, "Oh, Johanna!" And he just ran like into the new status quo area. So that it was a heart attack of lessons, right? You talk about what's in it for them or what's in it for us as change agents. And yeah, that was, nothing was going to stop him from getting to that new area. So the debrief, we talked about, try as you might, you can't control change. That was the lesson from Steve. And that was the first of, I don't know, probably 15 or 20 times I went to that conference over the number of years. So that was really kind of a life-altering trigger to think about change in a different way. At that same conference, Johanna Rothman did a session, and I remember asking her, I'm like, I like what you guys do here with this conference. I like that, you're helping people figure stuff out and you're helping increase, our skills and experience doing change stuff. And I think I want to do that too at some point. Like, how would I do that? And she said, just start writing, because start writing is the best way to formulate your thoughts and to make sense of what's going on in your brain. And you have no idea what can possibly go right when you start writing. That was another awesome piece of advice. And then another great one from Esther Derby. We all had one-on-ones with each of the hosts, because it's a small, they limit it to 80 people. So it's a pretty small conference with 4 hosts. And I remember the brain is full of all these ideas, and I'm talking to Esther and I said, how can I go fix all those people in my organization? How can I bring all these ideas back and get them to do this? And that's all she said. She said, Jason, it's not about you. And I was like, holy shit, you're right again. And it was another one of those frying pan to the head moments where it was just, it really switched, turned a switch on to focus on co-creation. Two more before we jump into the little session-y part. Don Gray was another one of the hosts, and this was a really interesting piece of advice. He did a session on reading the river, he called it. And we looked at the flow of current in an organization. And current meant a bunch of things. It meant relationships and hierarchy and power structures and all these things. And that represents the culture and the norms of how organizations work. And he said, sometimes you just need to swim with the current, not against it. So change is obviously disruptive. Some organizations tolerate disruption a little better than others, but there's going to be times when you're going to have to swim with things instead of against it. And the lesson was, because you'll burn out. You'll burn out and you'll get exhausted if you swim against it too much. And probably the most important one, Jerry, if you knew Jerry Weinberg or heard his name, give me a hell yeah in the chat or a thumbs up or something like that. Because I find he's quite well known in the Agile space. Not too many people outside of the Agile space have heard of him. He's written like 60 books. His first job title was computer, because he was one of 8 people in the world who could operate a computer. He wrote about the psychology of computer programming, and he's been talking about stuff that change agents are still discovering today in the 60s. Just wonderful, wonderful human. And this stuck out so much. Just the way things are not the way things are not the way they need to be. He did a really good session on think of a time you said yes and you wanted to say no. And this was at the height of his cancer. So he had cancer. He was in a wheelchair. He couldn't move. He had a microphone, somebody holding a microphone for him. And even with a microphone and a PA, you could barely hear him through the speakers. And he ran that session and all 80 people showed up to his. So they just canceled the rest of the conference and they went to his. And he sat there and he just said, I want everybody to say no. And we all collectively said no. And he goes, what was so hard about that? And it sounds so obvious, but when you hear it out loud, it's like, what is so hard? Like, what's the worst that's going to happen? And the session he did, he had two people in a fishbowl, and the first person had a scenario where they said yes and they wanted to say no. So they just reenacted the scenario and he coached them through it while the rest of us observed. And it was just unbelievable. And this quote came out of that to the star, who was the person who was being coached, was the way things are not the way that they need to be. And when you get a chance to kind of slow down and go for a walk or grab a coffee or do something, and you take yourself out of the soup, that quote just keeps replaying it in my head when I feel stuck. So I wanted to kind of use the inspiration from these folks at AYE and try to do something that was a little bit different, almost like a big group coaching session where like we're all stuck with something. And just to put a disclaimer on this, when I open up the tool for people to use, share what you're comfortable with, don't share what you're not comfortable with. This is not a therapy session. the intent of this is we've all got some stuff that we need help with, that we're stuck. It might be at work, it might be personal, but I want this to really be an opportunity for us as change agents to try to do a little self-care, try to say, you know, I can help people with this. I need help with this. I'm stuck with this. And then we can collect kind of a big brain collective of advice for common reasons why we tend to get stuck in our lives. And then hopefully a handful of people take away a small experiment or an action by the end of this session that you can try if you feel stuck. So